Happy Thursday afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Talking Stuff. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. I'll be joined momentarily by my co-host, Andrew Ellis. We're going to talk about Ohio State football recruiting, everything that seems important, and some of the things that don't. So that's what we do here on the podcast. So let's get right to it. Andrew Ellis joins us now. Welcome to the show, Andrew. We're not going to have a whole bunch of pleasantries to start it off because we just hate each other. But I do want to ask one question. The Bengals and Ravens are getting ready for a Thursday night battle. And I just want to know, how are you feeling as a Bengals fan? Do you feel good? Do you feel bad? And that's all. Just one word answer, good or bad?
I feel bad about tonight's game, but I feel okay about how things have gone lately. I don't like that T's not playing. I like the way they played against Baltimore last time, but that was in Cincy. I'm not expecting a win, but I would love to be pleasantly surprised tonight. So we'll see.
Oh, so I said one word answer and you gave me
I started with one word, bad, but then I wanted to elaborate a bit to explain why. So
okay. Yeah, I also feel bad because I don't trust the Bengals on primetime against good teams, but that's not here nor there. We're here to talk about Ohio State football recruiting, and the Buckeyes are getting ready to return to Columbus. They're playing at home this weekend against Purdue, another noon banger in Ohio Stadium, which is just getting old. Every game the rest of the way is going to be at noon for Ohio State in the regular season. We expect, the Northwestern game will be an 11 a.m. Central Time kickoff, which is just garbage at Wrigley Field. So no recruiting advantage there. The noon game against Indiana on the 23rd is certainly going to be interesting because if Indiana takes care of Michigan this weekend, they will unequivocally walk into Ohio Stadium as a top 10 undefeated team. And that game is going to take on all of a sudden like a pretty big recruiting significance for Ohio State. It'll probably turn into a big weekend. So we have plenty of time to get to that. And of course, the Michigan game at the end of the month will have a visitors list that will be quite extensive. This weekend against Purdue is not really an extensive recruiting list, but we'll get to some of the key players that we're expecting to see later in the show. But let's start with a guy that visited 2 weeks ago, Jordan Woods, a 6'4", 180-pound cornerback from Cartersville, Georgia, who's committed to Cincinnati. He is one of the players that I had been alluding to on Talking Stuff over the last month and a half that I knew Ohio State had been reaching out to and getting to know. I wasn't sure if they would offer him yet, but when he arrived on campus for that Nebraska game, it did pretty much signal that, hey, they're serious about this one. They offered. He has not made any other decisions about Cincinnati and his commitment there, but this is a situation, Andrew, where Ohio State really doesn't like recruit against a team like Cincinnati. So if they go after Jordan Woods here, I think that they'll probably get him. What's interesting is that Miami is sniffing around there as well. So we'll see if the Hurricanes make an offer. They're trying to get him to visit before offering, similar, I think, to the way that Ohio State did. So we'll see if that happens, and then they become a much bigger threat to Ohio State eventually flipping Jordan Woods than Cincinnati does.
Yeah, as you know, I've got a thing for big cornerbacks. So this kid's like 6'4" or whatever I think he's listed at. It's kind, I guess, like Ryan Watts is like a recent one that maybe kind of reminds me of that, but I have not even watched his highlight tape yet. I fully admit that. But they want 3 corners. So this is kind of a name that you've been quietly mentioning for a while now, and he popped up on campus, and now he's been offered. And now I assume he's going to return. And at this point, if you're battling Cincinnati, you have to like Ohio State's chances, and we'll see if Miami shakes things up at all with an offer on their end, I guess.
Yeah, Kentucky's also trying to get involved, but it feels like a situation where Ohio State should be in the driver's seat from here. The expectation is that Jordan will return for probably the Indiana weekend. I think that's what they're looking at right now as far as taking an official visit. So that we're in this weird time of the year where a lot of kids around the country, especially in places like Georgia, who go very deep into like middle of December when it comes to their high school playoffs, are just getting started. So Cartersville it's a good program down there. Again, you have to love the length at corner. That's something that Ohio State has always been fond of. I do think, from a recruiting rankings perspective and that kind of stuff, a player like Jordan Woods may not move the needle all that much. He's listed as a 3-star across all 4 of the major networks, or all 3 of the recruiting networks, including ESPN, or all 3 of the major recruiting networks, and also ESPN, who I refuse to consider a major recruiting network. His highest ranking on any one of them is as the 80th ranked cornerback in the country, according to On3 Sports. So it's not like you're looking at a guy that has been crazy, like elevating up the charts or whatever, but he is a guy that Ohio State's been watching for months. Tim Walton, who's obviously very familiar in Georgia and with Georgia, being that that's where he's from, was put onto this kid pretty early. He did not do a lot of the camp stuff this summer, so that's why I think a lot of people have him as a relative unknown. But the question everyone always asks anytime Ohio State makes an offer at a position where there's a player that's already committed, but maybe there's questions about, like Naeem Offord, is is this related to Naeem Offord? And the unequivocal answer to that is no, as Andrew just said. Ohio State wants a 3rd cornerback in this class and has wanted a 3rd cornerback in this class. We've already seen Devin Sanchez's father, Daniel Sanchez, on Twitter, like actively recruiting Jordan Woods, trying to, tell him to come be a part of the class. So we haven't seen that out of Naeem Offord, but that's not really been his way throughout the process. So if you're looking at it as a sign of doomsday for Naeem Offord, I would not. But it is worth noting that Naeem Offord this weekend is visiting LSU officially. They're playing Alabama at home. It's going to be a huge game. It's one of these things where you just kind of have to deal with it in the South. Like there are really good games every weekend, and these kids get wined and dined and have an opportunity to go watch an elite football game in an elite environment. It's hard to tell them that they shouldn't do that, but it's also, I think, frustrating for fans who are looking at the Naeem Offord recruitment, and here we are. It's a month until the early signing period, and it still feels like there's uncertainty about his intention. And no matter how much he or his family say the right things to Ohio State behind the scenes, they still haven't shown back up on campus. The plan to visit for the Nebraska game did not materialize. The expectation now is that he'll be in town for Michigan, and we haven't talked on Talking Stuff since then. Andrew, if Naeem Offord doesn't make it until the Michigan game, that's fine. But if he doesn't make it to the Michigan game, then it's like, wow, right?
Yeah, I think that's going to be what tells the tale is, does he show up for that game? I mean, he's had no problems getting to Auburn a dozen times. Now he's going to LSU. Obviously, proximity is a big factor there, and I can't blame him for wanting to go watch LSU play Alabama. But I mean, this one's just going to feel weird until the letter of intent comes in, is faxed in, or whatever the hell format they're using now. So this is not going to change, but I do think people should breathe a bit of a sigh of relief if he does visit for the Michigan game. But I don't think that if he does, I don't think it's like 100% done either. So
yeah, I think what's really interesting is that in some ways, and maybe this is just me putting on scarlet tinted glasses, but I actually think if he's going to visit one time during the season in an unofficial capacity, because he's already taken his official, if he's only going to visit once, it's probably more important that it happens 4 days before signing day than 6 weeks before signing day. So like, I guess I'm trying to see it from an optimistic point of view, because whether or not we like it, all of these trips to Auburn, this trip to LSU, if he ends up somewhere else next week, or if it gets back out to Oregon, every one of these trips is essentially a spot at the bargaining table now. Like, this is what we're doing. So I think from an Ohio State perspective, maybe it would be beneficial to have the opportunity to get in there with the best and last conversation, like we've talked about before for other players. Like, by that point, you would expect that anything that is on the table for Naeem Offord around the country, Ohio State would then have full knowledge of and be able to say, okay, this is where we can go. Is that enough for you? And I really hate that we have to always like tie in NIL conversation when we're talking about recruiting now, but like, it's impossible not to, because as the signing period draws closer, like all these teams around the country are going to start to panic. LSU which may very well now end up losing Bryce Underwood to Michigan. If that happens, like, again, we've talked about money in this NIL space before, and how it's not like it's just on a table where it's allocated like, okay, well, now we can move it from this pile to that pile. But if the LSU booster base is all of a sudden going to have an investment that isn't needed because Bryce Underwood signs with Michigan, then then you have to worry and wonder, like, okay, how does that money now go to, can they use it to try to entice Naeem Offord? Now, that being the case, we're still in a position with Jakeem Stewart where LSU is going to have to take a good portion of that funding for Jakeem Stewart. But we can talk about Jakeem and Damola Ajidahoon and the rest of the Ohio State 2025 targets right now, because I think that all those things are relevant conversations. But if we just go back to Jordan Woods, it's not a situation where the offer to Jordan Woods means anything for Naeem Offord. What does mean everything for Naeem Offord, in my opinion, and it seems like Andrews is getting him on campus on November 30th. Go ahead. You got something you want to say?
I was going to say, just to kind of put a bow on the Offord discussion and to confirm, you are of the understanding that all of these trips have been communicated to Tim Walton, communicated to the Ohio State ahead of time. So none of these are catching anybody in Columbus off guard, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, that's a positive, at least.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, we've said this before, but the communication and the way that the Offord family has dealt with Ohio State throughout this whole time has been above board, but it still doesn't feel good if you're an Ohio State fan. Here we are a month to signing day and you're still dealing with this. Like, you'd like to have it over with. But again, Jeremiah Smith, it went down to the day last year when he was a player who was much more outwardly vocal about loving Ohio State and never wanting to leave the class, and it still went down to the last day. So these are just the things you deal with now in 2024, almost 2025. Jakeem Stewart made the visit for the Nebraska game, and by all accounts, like, it went okay. This is where I think have to change our expectations on the recruiting front when it comes to these elite players. Like, number one, every visit these guys make, they're getting treated like kings and they're being catered to left and right. And no one's ever going to leave a visit and say, oh, it's a bad visit. Okay. But like, it also doesn't really matter, because when it comes down to it at the end of the recruitment, it's going to be about which team is putting together a more lucrative opportunity for the player and his people. And that's not necessarily just money. That also includes early playing time. That also includes development and all that stuff. So, but coming out of the visit, all I'm really heard about Jakeem Stewart was that Ohio State was trailing not just LSU, but Oregon in the battle for Jakeem Stewart. And that's fine. He's visiting LSU this weekend, making his official visit there. But he still has the official visit scheduled to Ohio State at the end of November. And similar to the Naeem Offord discussion, I don't think anything Ohio State really, there's nothing Ohio State's going to put on display or show off, or they could go out and have 16 sacks against Michigan on November 30th, and 14 of them could come from the defensive end position that he wants to play, and it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like, it's not about what you're doing on the field at this point. Everyone knows the Ohio State program is successful. Everyone knows the Ohio State program is going to win games. Everyone knows the Ohio State program is going to have a chance to put you in the league. But ultimately, it's about, okay, well, here's this high school now senior who has played a total of 10 games or so of high school football. And Ohio State is going to have to ask itself, is that resume worth the dollar amount that is being expected for a player of Jakeem Stewart's potential? And I don't know. That's where things get tricky.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the answer is yes, but we say this every time. I'm not the one paying that amount. So I get it.
Yeah. I mean, if you have extra a couple $1 million laying around, Andrew, I think you should probably be donating it to the program.
Yeah, we'll see about that. I will say I've seen some reporters suggest that Ohio State and Oregon are on top. And then I saw the LSU side say that getting to Oregon, like the distance or whatever, is a concern. So they think it's going to be LSU or Ohio State. I don't know. I'm just going to assume LSU until it's not LSU. But I don't think anybody really can say right now because he's still got those two big officials left. He's already official to Oregon, yes?
Yeah, and to USC.
Yeah, and USC, which it seems like they're running fourth. But I don't know. I'm just going to assume LSU until it's not LSU, I guess.
I think that's probably fair, and I think that's the tact I'm taking as well. The reality is there's a relationship with LSU and associate head coach / running backs coach Frank Wilson, which goes back years for not just Jakeem Stewart, but Jakeem Stewart's mentor and trainer, Clyde
Drexler.
Clyde Drexler. That's right. Clyde Alexander, I think is his name. It may not be. If it isn't, I'm sorry, but it doesn't really matter. There's a relationship there that goes back a long time, and it's that relationship, I think, which will give LSU the last conversation no matter what happens. So like everything that Ohio State does, everything that Oregon does, anything USC tries to do will be viewed through the lens of, okay, but now LSU gets to have the final conversation. And that's the way I think it probably should be when you're dealing with an in-state prospect like that. I don't think 4 years ago, the first time I saw Jakeem Stewart was before his freshman year of high school at the Army Combine in San Antonio, and he was like a freaky looking kid. But even then, like the expectation has always been he's an LSU kid. He's from St. Augustine. He's going to LSU. So we'll see. I don't think that if you're asking me right now, like based on the relationship, based on the potential, based on the productivity, based on the position of need and all that stuff, like I can see an argument on a couple of those facets, like positional need or long-term potential, where you would say if you had to choose between Naeem Offord or Jakeem Stewart, where do you want Ohio State to invest? I can see where people would say Jakeem Stewart, but I personally, after the year plus long-term relationship with Naeem Offord, I personally would rather see it go there. That's just because, and maybe I'll be dead wrong about this, Andrew. Maybe I'll end up eating my word about it, but I don't see a scenario at any of these schools where Jakeem Stewart is making an impact next year. I just don't see it. This is a kid who, for all intents and purposes, is missing 2 years of high school football. As I said, has played a total, I think, of 10 games at the varsity level. I know how freakish he can be. I know how big he is and how athletic he is. But like that's a large jump from not playing football for 2 years to then playing at Ohio State or LSU or Oregon as a true freshman and being an impact player. So I think there's a higher chance of Naeem Offord being an impact player next year than Jakeem Stewart. And we're in this era where, I mean, if you're looking at the recent college football news, like Dylan Stewart, there's conversation about how his contract essentially at South Carolina is being rewritten to prepare for year two. Like it's all 1 year deals. I mean, there's no guarantee that a player is going to be at your school for 2 or 3 years, especially if they're an elite prospect, especially if they're from thousands of miles away. And so like you almost have to view it from a who can contribute fastest and where do you get the best return for your buck. And I don't know that the return on the investment is guaranteed on a player like Jakeem Stewart. And that would scare me if I was in charge of those decisions.
Yeah, but I guess I can see a scenario where the 2025 Ohio State team would maybe need a player of at least of Jakeem Stewart's position to make an impact more than they would Naeem Offord with Jermaine Matthews and, guys like Aaron Scott, maybe Davis Igbenogson comes back. But the biggest thing, like you mentioned, is that the fact that he hasn't played for nearly 2 years. So it's kind of a moot point, I think, I guess. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah, but the conversation then, I mean, if we really want to then pivot it, think about a guy like Dylan Stewart, who, sure, USC or South Carolina is going to do everything they can to make sure he stays. But if you're Ohio State, isn't it make a lot more sense to take that?
Yes.
Let's call it $1.5 million. Let's doesn't it make more sense to find a player like that who's making an impact in the college level than a 17-year-old who hasn't played football for 2 years? Like I do think that there's a nuanced conversation here somewhere, but it is harder than ever, especially those impact positions and impact prospects, to project that they're going to be on your team for 3 years. So like you can't live in the world of saying, well, we got to get this guy and develop him, because it's just not likely to happen, especially at those elite high NFL priority positions. And we'll shift away from Jakeem Stewart here and move towards a player like Damola Ajidahun from Duluth, Georgia, who is also playing one of those elite positions at tackle, but his path looks longer, and his path looks to be one that at least you feel confident you'd get 2 years of the ability to develop before he decided to move elsewhere. And no, I guess ironically bringing up South Carolina, like that's where Ajidahun went back to last weekend. And there's at least a belief in Ohio State's circle right now that as long as he gets back for the Michigan game at the end of the month, that they think that they will win that battle. But like we've seen South Carolina pull off some things in the last couple of years where you're like, oh, that didn't expect to see that. And that's a program that Shane Beamer early in the year, they looked a little lost. Now they're winning some games and looking significantly better. So you do wonder if the proximity to home there makes some difference for a offensive lineman who we've talked about in the past. Generally, they're sort of homebodies, mama's boys. But I think long term for a player like Ajidahun, who you know that there's a development path for, makes more sense than a player like Jakeem Stewart, who, again, I don't see a scenario where Jakeem Stewart plays significant minutes at Ohio State as a freshman. And if that is true, and again, I could completely eat my words, if that is true, I have a tough time seeing him staying any place where he's not playing a lot as a true freshman, based on the expectation, based on the dollar amount, based on the influences in his life. So it's like this weird circle of garbage.
Yeah, I mean, just sticking with the Ajidahun, like I'm hoping Ohio State is doing everything in their power to get that one done. He looks like a tackle. He does not look like a David Sanders type of tackle who can maybe start right away on the left side, but you need those bodies. I mean, hell, we've seen that this year with how things have trended. What's happened with the offensive line this year? I don't like that he's been to South Carolina like 4 times already and is expected to go back there again in the coming weeks. Seems like they've been involved longer than Ohio State, so that's a concern. But maybe if he makes it into town for the Michigan game, maybe that's enough to win that battle. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Ohio State has 3 offensive linemen committed. They would like to get to 5. There is still a conversation about Micah DeBose, and we'll see if he shows up for the Ohio State Michigan game, as we talked about in the last episode of Talking Stuff. I think that there's a rational way that happens without freaking out the Alabama fan base and the Alabama coaching staff, because I think that obviously with a lot of family in Ohio, Micah may be up in the Northeast Ohio area for Thanksgiving, as it were, which opens the door for him to just pop down to Columbus for the game on November 30th. So I think if you get both of those guys there on November 30th, and then you add obviously Carter Lowe and Jake Cook and Javon McFadden will all be there, then I think you have an opportunity to really completely change the narrative about this 2025 offensive line recruiting class, which, I mean, to some degree, that's already mellowed just because the 3 you have are pretty darn good, and Jake Cook is playing great football. Like Carter Lowe is a true tackle body as well, developing into one more and more. But Ajidahun and Micah DeBose would take this offensive line class to a next level, and they need it. They need it badly, because as you said, like the depth at tackle especially is pretty rough. And the reality is, even if you do sign both of those 2, if you're able to flip them both from Georgia Tech and Alabama, you probably still need a transfer guy at tackle anyhow. So like if we're just zooming out and taking a look at the class of 2025, which is still ranked the number 1 class in the country, despite feeling like it's been stagnating for a while, you have nothing else happening at quarterback. We have, it seems like, some movement on Turbo Rogers from Alabama, who's committed to Alabama. Was it Andrew Bone from On3 Alabama site on early on Wednesday said that he doesn't think that he will sign with Alabama. It seems like the two sides are going different ways. That's interesting because it does open the door for Ohio State, and the Buckeyes are way more receptive to the idea of adding Turbo Rogers right now than they were 6 weeks ago, which is why he's making the official visit this weekend and not when it was originally scheduled for the Nebraska game, which we talked about. Like I kept saying, I don't think that visit's going to happen. There has been some movement in the last couple of weeks to indicate that they're reassessing their position with running backs and how many they need. I've actually heard that even if they flipped Turbo Rogers, that there's a chance they would still look for a transfer portal guy as well at that spot, because obviously you lose a lot of depth and talent when Travion Henderson and Quinshad Judkins leave after this year. So you've got Turbo Rogers at running back. It seems to me, and again, I may end up eating my words here, I think the Preston Bowman discussion is kind of DOA right now. So offensively, the Buckeyes are looking at adding another running back, and Turbo Rogers certainly seems to be the most likely option. And then 2 offensive linemen. So that takes the class right there to 29 guys, which assuming that Naeem Offord stays. So we are entering that 30-man signing class, which I don't think anyone ever thought Ohio State would really do. And then there's still conversation about Malik Autry, the Auburn defensive tackle commit, who has said that he was going to make it to 2 different Ohio State games this season. He hasn't made it to any. We'll see if he makes it to the Michigan game. And that, I think, is pretty much it, right? I mean, there's not really much else out there other than Jordan Woods. So now you're talking 31 guys. That'd be pretty crazy.
Yeah, and then obviously,
am I missing someone? I feel like I'm missing someone.
I don't think you are. I think it's just a matter of, they're still trying to keep several guys. You mentioned Offord, but Miami is coming at several. Who's Miami?
Yeah, Jarquez Carter.
Yeah, Carter, and then
TJ Alford.
Yeah, so there, and then you got Zahir Mathis with Penn State trying to get him too, and
the Naeem Offord stuff, obviously. So yeah, I mean, there's a way you could lose 3 guys between now and then, but Ohio State hasn't seemed overly worried about that. But at the same time, like, as we said, as you get closer to signing day, other teams start to get more aggressive and or desperate, depending on whatever word you want to use. And when that happens, things get wonky.
Yes, they do.
Do you feel like things are wonky?
Yeah, I mean, not terribly wonky. I did want to touch on Rogers a bit more because you've been the wettest of wet blankets with that over the last couple of months. What I mean, I know you obviously talk to the Ohio State staff on occasion and whatnot. Like, what's changed? Because they're going to expect obviously Trey and Quinshon to be gone. They love James Peoples. I mean, we've been saying for a while they just need numbers, but it didn't seem like they were going to go that route, and now it suddenly seems like they are, which I'm in favor of. But what's your vibe there?
The real difference is that so you've got Isaiah West, who they love. You got Bo Jackson, who they love, who's had some injury problems, but Ohio State doesn't seem to think that's a problem long term. The real difference is that Turbo Rogers is not a traditional true running back, and he's a guy that does different things, and he can help in the return game. He can help in the slot. So that's why I think the discussion has changed a little bit. And maybe it's because Ohio State is just desperate for playmakers on special teams. I don't know. Maybe he's a guy that they think can be a change of pace return man. I don't know exactly what's happened. I know that the relationship between Anthony Turbo Rogers and Carlos Locklyn has always been great. Locklyn is the first guy that offered him a scholarship. He's from the same hometown. Like those things are real. And as I said a couple of weeks ago, in my mind, Ohio State was not going to let him take a visit if they weren't sure that they would have room for him. He's taking the visit this weekend. So something has changed. And I think a lot of the calculus is what I just said. He's not a true running back. And so you can bring him in without upsetting the natural order of things when it comes to Isaiah West and Bo Jackson, both of which are not going to scoff at the idea of more competition anyway. But I do think it makes it easier because I believe Ohio State will probably still need to bring in a veteran transfer portal running back as well. Because so these numbers, it does feel crazy to talk about it like this with Ohio State, because now all of a sudden, if you bring in a transfer running back and a transfer offensive tackle and a transfer defensive tackle or a transfer linebacker, all of a sudden now we're talking 35, 36 guys. And so it does feel like the Buckeyes are much more committed to the idea that there's going to be a lot of roster transition after this year. Some of it natural, some of it just attrition that comes from this new generation of college football. And so I think it's like, hey, if this really talented player who's got a skill set that we don't have can come in and fill a role, how do you say no? Especially when the existing relationship there is so good. So we'll talk about more running backs if we can, because obviously the Turbo Rogers official visit highlights the weekend, but Derek Cooper from from Chaminade Madonna down there in Hollywood, California. That's the high school that produced Jeremiah Smith. He is the number 1 ranked running back / athlete in the country, according to Rivals.com. He's really, really good, like really good. He'll visit this weekend, and so does Savion Hyder from Virginia, who I think is On3s.com's number 1 running back in the class of 2026. So both of those guys will be in town. So he's the number 1 ranked. Hyder is the number 1 ranked running back in the 247 composite. He is the number 1 ranked running back on 3 and Rivals. So he's pretty darn good as well. Both of those guys will be in town this weekend. And I think it's interesting. I mean, from a game perspective or game plan perspective from Ohio State, how much we'll see the running backs take over this weekend, because you're going to have with Rogers, with Hyder, and with Derek Cooper, 3 of the best running backs in the country. 3 of the top 2 running backs in the country, in my opinion, in the class of 2026. So big weekend for Carlos Locklyn, really his first one since being at Ohio State, where you are going to see how he balances these things. But more specifically for Cooper and Hyder, an opportunity to see Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins both get a lot of run in the same game, because those 2 were in the same class, obviously, and people will probably attempt to convince them that they can't go to the same school. So, and Ohio State, I think, is really the only school in the mix that's recruiting them both aggressively, although Georgia's coming after Hyder, and Derek Cooper was once committed to Georgia. But I think that one's going to end up being an Ohio State versus the Florida trio battle, really, ultimately, because the Buckeyes' relationship at Chaminade Madonna and his relationship with Jeremiah Smith is pretty good. There's a lot, Andrew. Am I talking too much? You want to talk? You have something to say?
No, I was just going to say it might be a good weekend to bet the over on rushing yards for Trey and Quinshon. I have no idea how much coaches do that. If they're bringing in guys, if they really try to load up the passing game or load up the running game or target. There was a game a couple years back where they had tight ends visiting, and I swear they threw the ball to the tight end 80 times that game.
Well, it happened earlier this year. They brought in the kid from Illinois, the big receiving tight end from Illinois, whose name is escaping me right now. Max Sutter, I think. They brought in Mac, and after not throwing to the tight end in the first week of the season, they threw to the tight end 10 times in the second week. So I don't know that that's a coincidence. Now, they're not going to abandon their entire game plan when it comes to, or trying to convince players. But these kids they all know who Quinshon Judkins is and who Travion Henderson is. So it's a little different scenario, I think, than the tight end play, because tight end play at Ohio State has oftentimes been something that people try to sell against recruits by saying if they don't use the tight end. So we'll see. Who else? Big visitors this weekend. We'll just drive into the 4-minute offense here and wrap this up. The biggest visitors this weekend, Andrew, as you look at the names, is there anybody that really stands out to you as hey, I'm interested in that guy's recruitment?
The ones I wanted to ask you about were guys that were visiting elsewhere for the most part. I mean, we talked about the Turbo Rogers visit. That one we've been watching for a while. I'm happy that he's finally visiting after weeks of seeming like it wasn't going to happen. I was going to ask you about a couple of 2026. Actually, let's start with 2025. So my first question to you is going to be an in or out. Can we just do that real quick?
Sure.
Do you think that Ohio State will get one of Micah DeBose or Ajudahan for offense?
Yes.
Do you think they'll get one of those guys?
Yes.
Do you have a lean right now on one or the other?
I'd probably lean toward Ajudahan just because it seems cleaner. But again, DeBose is someone I've talked about since August, that I think the Ohio State has a real chance, but I'd probably lean Ajitahoon.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, my other questions are 2026. So we've talked a lot about the in-state class. Ohio State could, in theory, for 2026, just sign a bunch of Ohio kids for cornerback and offensive line, and that could essentially make up the entire class at those positions. Some of those guys I kind of thought might have committed by now, a little bit early, but still I kind of thought they might. Albert Hill, the Akron corner, has visited Oregon multiple times. He's visiting Oregon again this weekend. Alarm bells at all, or just I know he's 2026 and there's a ton of time with this, but any thoughts?
No, again, I think we're spoiled in a way when it comes to Ohio prospects, and the idea has always been that they aren't like other kids around the country, and they are. Like they get an opportunity to go see other places. Every one of these visits, especially in the NIL world we live in, changes the conversation just a little bit with Ohio State. It prevents Ohio State, I think, from trying to take them for granted or get them at a discount or anything like that. And I have a tough time believing Albert Hill ends up signing anywhere other than Ohio State. But you don't, you'd like to see all these kids in the class of 2026 who have an offer inside of the state be done with. But they're not. And most of them I talk to, and they generally indicate that they're looking towards a decision in the spring. So you just have to deal with this for a few more months and see what happens for Ohio State, like in March and April when these kids decide to start wrapping things up. Now that's not to say that everyone should be taken for granted. Again, Oregon does a great job. They're certainly making it interesting, but similar to what you're talking about earlier with the LSU folks and believing that Oregon is just too far for Jakeem Stewart to go, I do think it's probably harder to imagine Albert Hill choosing Oregon when the family will have to fly there every weekend to see him play versus driving in the car for an hour to get to Columbus. So yeah, it's bothersome, but it's 2024 and this is recruiting now. Ohio kids are not different than any other kids. They have an opportunity to expand their brand and expand their value, and they're taking it.
Yeah, that makes sense. One more 2026, technically two actually, and then I want to finish things with a quick 2027 question. So I've had enough of Auburn. Aiden Harris, one of the top Ohio State targets for 2026, defensive lineman from North Carolina. I know Rivals has him in the top 50. His brother, Andrew Harris, not quite as highly ranked, but it's going to be one of those Armstrong situations where you're going to take them both. All the crystal balls, future casts, and everything for those guys are on Ohio State. They both visited Auburn last weekend to watch Auburn lose to, I think it was freaking Vanderbilt. And coming out of the weekend now, Auburn is expecting both of those kids to commit to them within the next week. Why? I know the answer is probably what everybody thinks the answer is, but that's just, it's just weird.
I think that the answer is probably what everyone thinks it is. And there are teams, and this is a subtle difference. And maybe it's not that subtle. Ohio State does not discuss NIL dollars and specific amounts, and we're going to give you this with high school juniors. Okay. Like those are discussions that happen on official visits. Those are discussions that happen as you get close to signing day. And the reality is, I think North Carolina now is allowing NIL for players in the state in high school. And so I think that could be changing the conversation a little bit for these players, because when you have aggressive boosters who are willing to make investments, God, it's so funny trying to use all these euphemisms, to make investments now, you are able to move kids to earlier decisions, but those decisions quite literally mean nothing. And like from an Ohio State perspective, here you have Aiden Harris, who's supposed to visit for the Michigan game. You have this discussion happening about, I love Ohio State. I love Larry Johnson. I want to be a Buckeye. All those things. I mean, starting at the beginning of this football season, that was the discussion with Aiden Harris. And now here we are, mid-November. If Ohio State has a decision to make at defensive line coach, for example, doesn't matter if Aiden Harris commits to Ohio State now, because nothing changes. There's still going to be a whole nother year of recruiting this kid. And if Ohio State has a new defensive line coach, or Auburn lost their defensive line coach this last year, right? So they have a first-year defensive line coach. I have a tough time seeing how it makes an impact. Now, what they do have is they have guys like Amaris Williams, who Ohio State recruited last year from North Carolina. Like they have the proximity to home. They have a lot of the other stuff, but they also have a dumpster fire of a program that it sells kids on the idea that, we need to, all you guys, to change our futures. And kids just don't care about losing games when they're not at the program. That's I think a big reality. They believe, every high school recruit believes nearly hook, line, and sinker whatever a college coach tells them, because they're taught to believe that your coach is someone that is an honest man who is going to tell you the truth, and you're not, don't be skeptical of what your coach is saying. And if you are having all these conversations with all these coaches over and over, you just start to say, yeah, that program's, it's really not even in that bad a shape. Look how many people show up at their games. It doesn't matter if they lose. Like, they still get great support. Like, all those things matter. If Aiden Harris commits to Auburn in the next week or two and doesn't make his visit to Ohio State, then sure, it matters. And there's at least a step back that puts in front of Ohio State an obstacle. But if he doesn't commit to Auburn and he visits Ohio State for the Michigan game, he's going to walk out of Ohio Stadium and walk out of Columbus that week telling everyone that Ohio State's the place he wants to be, because that's just where we're at. And again, as someone who covers recruiting full time, it is hard to say this without cutting off my nose to spite my face. Like, the early recruiting conversations, the sophomore conversations, the junior conversations matter so much less than they ever have before. And if we allow ourselves to get caught up in the minutia of all of them, all that's going to happen is we're going to wake up every 3 months, and player A or player B or player C, who you're like, oh man, I really wanted that guy. Now he decommitted from Georgia. Now he decommitted from Tennessee. Now he decommitted from Miami. Like, it's a game to the kids. It's a game to their handlers and their agents. Like, it is all designed to generate as much buzz and publicity and money as possible for these kids at this point and the people around them. And that sounds cynical, but at the end of the day, when decisions have to really get made, which is now for the class of 2025, it generally still comes back around to which place is going to develop me the best, which relationships are the best. But all of the conversations early enough for 95% of the kids around the country, the early discussions are all just superficial fluff. And so the experiences that the kids have getting to campus, showing up for the Ohio State Michigan game, watching the best rivalry in sports in person, like, those things are going to matter a whole lot more than whatever Auburn did or said last weekend when they were getting embarrassed at home by Vanderbilt. So we'll see, but I don't buy 95% of the conversations that happen around high school recruiting right now, unless it is in their senior season, because nothing matters. It is all just designed for clicks, and it's sad. It makes me sad. But
yeah, next guy I'm this quick. I want to ask about is not even close to his senior season, but Brady Edmonds, 2027 quarterback, California. I believe he's been wanting to end his recruitment by the end of the year. We're in November now. From your perspective, are all signs kind of still pointing to him being the guy? I know Texas is in there, Penn State's in there, maybe USC's in there, but what are your feelings there?
Ohio State is not going to be in a hurry to add a 2027 quarterback. We saw them host Trey Taylor from Carmel, Illinois, for the Nebraska game. He's a really good player in that class as well. They do like Brady Edmonds a lot. they don't want anyone to commit that early when it comes to quarterback position because these are players in their sophomore season of high school football. Ideally, you'd want to wait till someone's played 3 years of high school football to determine if they're on the right track and on the right development path. So that doesn't mean that if Edmonds is ready to pull the trigger at the end of December that they'll say no, but I don't think Ohio State is encouraging any high school sophomore in the country who plays quarterback, the most difficult position in the sports to play, encouraging them to hurry up and get a decision made. So I think if a decision was made right now by Brady Edmonds, he'd pick Ohio State. So I don't think anything has changed there. But the best thing for both sides is continued evaluation and continued development for Brady Edmonds. That's my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just a cynic. Maybe I've grown weary of all of this stuff. But I do think that there is a honest conversation out there that has to happen, which is you're playing really well. You're a sophomore in high school. A lot of things can happen between now and the time you sign a letter of intent. Although that's not going to exist anymore either. So, who knows? A long way to go. Really good player. Loves Ohio State. They love him. They've recruited him as hard as they can recruit a 2027 quarterback.
Yeah, that makes sense. I always feel obligated to ask about him because there's really not a guy for 2026 that we've talked about immensely or that Ohio State is kind of honed in on. So,
yeah, it's hard to do that. There's so many, and it goes back to what I said earlier. We're living in a time where you generally have to view the roster 1 year at a time, and in these months, yeah, there's a lot of concern about making sure signing day goes off without a hitch, and the guys you've recruited for the last year and a half sign. But winning a national championship for Ohio State is far more important than deciding which 2026 quarterback they need to recruit, who will be their third string quarterback in the year 2028. It's
yeah.
I don't want to minimize the impact or the importance of recruiting because obviously it matters, but the way the conversation around it has evolved, I think, forces us to acknowledge that there's the right now and everything else is on the table, like between the transfer portal, between NIL, between coaches leaving, between conference realignment and schedule, like everything is just different. So you have to. It's about this year. It's about what is happening in recruiting next month. Ohio State has so much power and so much brand recognition and so much of an ability to change a recruitment for any player in the country if they get interested and get involved, that outside of the next month, signing day, it's hard to dismiss any player that Ohio State could be recruiting, and it's hard to suggest that there's any player that's so important at this point, other than the guys who need to sign next month, because you can't really replace them now. So I don't know.
Got it.
Was that negative? Is that just a dose of reality, a hard dose of reality?
Yeah, I think it was a fair statement. So all good.
I mean, I love it. I love recruiting. I think I've said it for a decade plus. Like, it's the most important thing in college football, but we have to be willing to adjust how we view it, because if you're still trying to look at recruiting results and look at recruiting like goings-ons in the same way that we did in 2014, it's going to drive you crazy.
Right. True.
But I don't know. Who knows? Anything else?
Nope. That's all I got.
Thanks. I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you, America, listening, watching, being on this journey with us. If you have made it this far, please like and subscribe to the podcast. Like this video. That helps us on the algorithms. Tell your friends, set your notifications. We try to bring you guys interesting conversation on this channel. We appreciate you being here. This has been Talking Stuff on the podcast. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. He's Andrew Ellis. See you next time.